Welcome back. Okay.
So we're all set? Okay. All right. So everybody, now we're going to begin our journey. And we're going to begin by going through, starting with the awakening and all the way up to the, hopefully the fifth initiation today. And remember, as I go through this, remember that in a certain sense, you're going to recognize elements of all of them. But in time and space, there is a sequence to them over many incarnations. So let's begin by talking about the awakening. And I do want to bring that one image back up that we ended with, just because this is a good starting point for me. So I mentioned the aspirant, the person that is just awakening to the soul, but there's no soul infusion yet. Now, so keep in mind that so what I want to talk about is this whole phase right here, not only this process, but the movement toward this process, okay? So just kind of keep that in mind. Now, the thing I want you to know is that first, before you become an aspirant, for hundreds and hundreds of lifetimes, we've lived our lives, and those lives are not based upon awakening to the soul. It's actually about, as I mentioned earlier, it's about developing the personality and eventually an integrated ego personality. And that doesn't mean that the soul is not existing. The soul and the causal body are in the game all along. It's just that the lower self is not capable yet or ready yet to actually have a conscious realization of the causal body and the soul's consciousness. So for many, many lifetimes, the causal body is sort of sitting in wait, you might say, waiting for that personality to get its act together and become a more integrated personality. Because in the end, the soul needs an integrated personality. Like I said earlier, it needs the three parts of the personality in order to express through. And so it's a very important notion that for many, many incarnations, the main evolutionary goal is to develop the lower self. But then you have what we call the awakening. There will be one particular incarnation that will occur for someone where for the first time they awaken to something deep inside that feels profoundly spiritual and almost Christ-like. And this is what we mean by the awakening. Now, it's interesting because it's an awakening to the soul's love and wisdom, the causal body's love and wisdom, but it's often misinterpreted by people when this occurs to them. For some people, for instance, it's misinterpreted as a master came to me. In fact, that's not exactly what happened at all. You've woken up to your own causal body for the first time, and because it's a foreign realization within your personality, it seems like it's another entity, but it's not. It's actually the discovery of your own higher self, okay? And it's also very, it has a lot of correlations to the so-called born-again Christian experience, where the born-again Christian says, I'm saved, Jesus came to me, I'm saved. Well, occultly understood, Jesus didn't come to you at all. The Master Jesus, as there is a Master Jesus, but the notion is that you've awoken to something inside you that is Christ-like, because your causal body is naturally, the substance of the causal body is a natural recipient of what is sometimes called the cosmic Christ or the Christ principle. And so the personality, in a Judeo-Christian world, the personality looks at this and says, boy, that everything I've ever heard about Jesus coming and saving you and that sort of thing, that's how it kind of felt like. It certainly felt that way. Must have been Jesus. I'm saved. Praise the Lord. But it's not that at all. It's awakening to your own Christ within. Now, this awakening is, interestingly, it's fleeting. When it happens, it comes and goes. And what the result of that is that it leads to a search. Now, its fleetingness can be distressful to the personality, but the truth is that it's even though it's a brief experience and then it goes away, what's happened is that the soul has planted a seed deep within the recesses of consciousness. And that seed will, over time, over much time, will germinate and become a much more awakened consciousness as a result of that. And so that's such a pivotal time in the long history of human existence, from the time of individualization back in ancient Lemuria, all the way to full enlightenment. This is a pivotal time of awakening to a higher part of yourself. Even though fleeting, there's something left behind that is going to be developed. Now, what happens is a person will often go in two directions, because what they want to do is they want to recapture it. They had this wonderful experience. Maybe they've defined it, but it's nonetheless a wonderful experience. And people start looking for what's out in the society, out in the world, that can maybe help them recapture it. So people usually go one of two routes in the process of trying to recapture it. For some people, they go the way of orthodoxy. So they look for religion, and religion in the religions will give you a set of doctrines that to believe in. And oftentimes it goes very conservative, because there's a kind of subtle attitude that the conservative kind of literalist quality or belief within a religion is often the one that's been around the longest, and therefore it must be more true. So that's where you get the born again Christian, or that's where you get the fundamentalist practitioner of Hinduism, or in Islam, that sort of thing. All of that is simply the process of trying to recapture something that is legitimately had been experienced within. So they go one of two routes. So that's the one route. The other route is what I often call, for lack of another term, I say they go the route of new age smorgasbord shopping. So they go to some workshop in the new age world, and well, that was interesting, but it didn't really happen. Must not be right. Go to this. Jumping around. So they jump around and look all over the place. The Tibetan in the Alice Bailey writings calls it the process of entrance into the den of futility, or no, the network of futility. The network of futility. So in both cases, there's a shortcoming. In the fundamentalist perspective, the literalist perspective, they grab something and want to go focus very much on in a deep way, whereas the smorgasbord New Age approach is wide but shallow, and yet nothing is the same, because this seed has been deeply planted, and this is the beginning of what in esotericism is called the probationary path. It's awakening to the probationary path. Now, the probationary path can take more than one incarnation to complete the probationary path. It's pre-initiation. It's sort of setting the stage for initiation. And what happens is that you have what has been called the beginning of the periodic downward gazing soul. Downward gazing soul. By that I mean that that kind of mystical experience that they had will occasionally come back, and they will have that, and that's because the soul is periodically downward gazing. It's interesting. It is said that the soul in each of us can look in three directions, and it sort of is in meditation, but it meditates in three different ways. It's always meditating. Your soul is always in meditation in a certain sense. There's sometimes when the soul is meditating outward on its own level. Now, the causal body is found on the higher mental plane, so it's meditating horizontally, you might say, and coming on rapport with the group of souls that it's a part of. Sometimes the soul meditates upward, and it's coming into relationship to the greater life and the ashram that it's a part of. But sometimes it's downward gazing. And when it's downward gazing, that's when the personality has an experience. Now, usually I talk about that when I talk about creative magic, but here that downward gaze has to do with just coming into an awareness of a higher part of you again. So over time, there can be some repetition of this because periodically the soul will downward gaze. Now, eventually that stabilizes, and eventually the soul learns how to look in all three directions at the same time. So there comes a point where the soul is going to be constantly downward gazing. And that comes at the end of the probationary path, and it's one of the characteristics of the first initiation. For now, it's periodic. Another thing that's happening during this phase of the process is that an individual is beginning the process of building the Antakarana. They're not conscious of it, but it's there. Now, I'm not sure how many of you know about the Antakarana, but the Antakarana is a big subject in this philosophy. It represents the communication bridge that links the soul with the personality internally. When that Antakarana is fully built, then it's like a whole different regime occurs. And that there's a point on the journey at a certain initiation where that actually takes place, and I'll mention that when I get there. But for just realize that all of us are building this Antakarana, but the first potential of it being constructed is because of the awakening. The awakening is sort of like the first tenuous threads of the Antakarana being built between the personality mind and the causal body. It is said that there are three things that really facilitate the building of the Antakarana for all of us, really. One of those things is study, which means really develop your higher mind. The other is service, heartfelt service. And the third is meditation. Sometimes that's called the three pillars. And those three pillars are what helps build the Antakarana. And my point is that at this point, on the probationary path, the first tenuous construction of the Antakarana is occurring, though the individual initially isn't aware of it. All they know is something's happened. Later on, you become a little bit more aware of this inward road, you might say. The Antakarana is a communication conduit that makes it possible for the soul to express its wisdom through the personality. But it doesn't exist naturally. As I say, it has to be built. And it's built with those three things over many incarnations, but it's built with acceleration when you become more conscious of it. It has been said that the probationary path is the path of mysticism. It's the mystical path. Whereas once you hit the first initiation, you're transitioning into the occult path. One of the things that's interesting about the probationary disciple is that they're often initially preoccupied with duality, particularly the inner duality. There's a preoccupation with the idea that I had this experience. It felt sacred, but now it's gone. So it was there and it's not. There's a duality in a sense of, I want to find a way of bridging that. I don't know what happened, but it's an experience I'll never forget. How do I bridge it? So there's a preoccupation with the sort of two-ness of it. Eventually that synthesizes and it's no longer an emphasis because it's more permanently realized within you. But initially it's a preoccupation. Now what happens is at a certain point on the probationary path, the individual will, how to put this, they will go into a period of self-reflection and start to wonder, I wonder if the reason why I don't seem to be holding, I have these fleeting experiences and then they disappear. Could it be me? Could it be something about me that I better work on? And so what happens is the probationary path in the big picture is really about developing a sense of good character building. You start building more consciously your personality instrument so you start to realize, you start to think about your thoughts more. You become more introspective. You start to look at how am I thinking about things? Is that wholesome or unwholesome? You start to be more attentive to your emotional nature and to your physical activities. So you start to, as the Tibetan would say in the Alice Bailey writings, the probationary path ultimately is a process by which you're slowly trying to discipline yourself, become a fit receptacle for the Christ. Now, the Christ here, I mean the Christ as the causal body, even though the individual himself may see it as the Christ as Jesus. No, it's the Christ as the causal body that we're talking about, to be a fit receptacle to the Christ. So there's another name for the path of purification, path of probation that I want to share with you. In some of the literature, it's been called the path of purification. Path of purification. I'm starting to recognize that I need to purify my lower self and to make myself a better fit instrument. And also, it's really the time when you're becoming more of a conscious participant in your own, you might say, your own development. Interestingly, on a side note, when looked at from the whole of humanity, because remember, in this philosophy, all of humanity, in the higher sense, is one entity, one being, and it has a soul, and it has a personality, and it's trying to transform the lower in support of the higher, just like you and me. And I mention this now because we are told that humanity itself, as a whole, is on the probationary path, as a whole. Doesn't mean that everybody in humanity is on the probationary path, far from it. But it means that in the collective vibration of the whole of humanity, that's where it is. And it's walking toward the first initiation, which is really amazing that this initiatory possibility is right in front of us. Now, I'll probably talk about that a little bit when I get to the first initiation, but just realize that right now we're on the probationary path. We're on the probationary path as a whole. And I mentioned to you earlier about how it's understood that crisis is always a part of this process of approaching initiation. Well, you can certainly see it on a global level. All you have to do is watch the news to see that it's not hard to see that humanity as a whole is going through huge crisis. It's sometimes called the period of the burning ground. So for all of humanity, as it slowly approaches this first initiation, as it, on the probationary path approaching it, we as a whole are walking the burning ground. It's walking on hot coals. And yet the same principle is true for each of us individually, friends. Each of us has to walk a burning ground, not just be in terms of being able to take an initiation. Let me explain why that is, because I just showed you that little story. I gave you that little story about how the resisting personality says not so fast. Well, what you need to understand is that the human kingdom as a whole is governed by two rays. It has a soul ray and it has a personality ray. The personality ray of humanity is the fifth ray, which is having a lot to do with development of mind. But the soul ray of humanity is not fifth ray, it's fourth ray. So the whole of humanity as a soulful entity is fourth ray. Okay, well, and that makes sense too, because remember, humanity is the fourth kingdom. So it's ruled by the fourth ray. First kingdom is the mineral, second is plant, third is animal, fourth is human. There's three above as well that are on the inner levels. But we're the fourth kingdom of nature. And so as a totality, the human kingdom is particularly related to the fourth ray. But the fourth ray is called the ray of harmony through conflict. That's the name, harmony through conflict. It's not called the ray of harmony and conflict. It's not called that. It's called the ray of through conflict, harmony through conflict. It's in this kingdom, and only in this kingdom, where conflict and crisis are actually built into the process of evolution. So, and my little story earlier before the break having to do with the resistant personality that's saying, not so fast, I'm not giving up control. There's the conflict, there's the challenge. But also on the larger scale, as humanity's approaching the first initiation, look at the conflict in the world today and the extremes of polarity that are going on today. It's astounding. And so we are walking the burning ground, and the coals are hot. The coals are hot collectively. But the same is true. We have to prove ourselves. We have to, the burning ground period is a testing time. It's a testing time to see if the individual, or if we're talking about humanity, if humanity as a whole is ready to rise to the occasion. And so think of these crises leading up to an initiation as being related to some sort of proving yourself, proving that we're ready for what is the next step. That's why, and by the way, it's not true in the plant kingdom. There's a fascinating evolution of what happens in the plant domain and the animal domain and the mineral domain. All of those are categories of consciousness evolving. All of them are, in their collectivity, are governed by certain rays as they evolve. But it's only in the human kingdom where this strong emphasis on the fourth ray is being emphasized. By the way, the fifth kingdom of nature, which is the kingdom of the soul, which is where we're going, is ruled by the fifth ray too. So the lower aspects of humanity are fifth ray, but the fifth kingdom of nature is also very related to the fifth ray on a higher level, you see. Anyway, so that gives you a sense of why we call it probationary, because it is probationary. We have to prove ourselves, and that's why it does take time to do this.
Can you tell by where the stars are and stuff when there may be some peace for humanity? Yeah. That's what I'm wondering in the world at this time, because it's quite severe. A lot of people are wondering at what point is this going to settle a little. And you're the one, the astrological chart, those key planets that might be at a point where that could happen. There's my question.
Well, if I could predict that, if I could do that, I'd have another name. I'd be called the Master. I don't know that. I don't know that. I know I can see the tension in the sky, and I can understand the tension, and I can see when things are going to ease up. But it would be a little bit reckless for me to speculate when we're doing it. I do know that we're approaching a real critical time, friends. We're approaching the 2025. Okay, I can see I'm going to be on a tangent here. This happens. But, sorry about that. But we're in what is we're in the period which is called the stage of the Forerunner. And the stage of the Forerunner began in the year 1945 at the conclusion of World War II. And according to the Tibetan, the stage of the Forerunner runs its course and ends in the year 2025. So we're very close. So in the esoteric community, there's a huge emphasis on the importance of what's approaching. And it doesn't mean that astrologically everything looks rosy in 2025. It doesn't mean that at all. What's going on is that in the year 2025, we're told that the masters, every 100 years, on the 25th year of a century, always meet in conclave. So they have a meeting every 100 years, and that meeting is all. And it's, by the way, it's not just headed by the Christ, but even Sanat Kumara is attending this thing. And it's of course, you wonder, how does that work? And it's certainly not at a Hilton hotel, I assure you. It's actually a fusion of monads deep within coming into rapport for the purpose of making decisions that support the evolution of humanity and the other kingdoms of nature for the next 100 years. So we are at the tail end of what is called the era of the Forerunner. And there's a couple things to say about that. Number one is that there's a couple things that happen during the conclave of 2025, we're told anyway. One is that some decisions will be made by the Maitreya himself, the Christ himself, about the nature of the externalization of the reappearance of the Christ and the externalization of the whole hierarchy, because the hierarchy itself is said to be preparing itself to externalize itself. And the new group of world servers, or the forerunners, they are the people that are forerunning the preparations for not only the dawning of age, but also the possibility of the reappearance of the Christ, and certainly the externalization of the hierarchy. In fact, the disciples of the world, the forerunners, are you might say, the vanguard group in front of the masters who are behind them to eventually externalize in this century, it looks like. But don't ask me the exact date, we have no idea. But we do know that in 2025, big decisions around all of that by these masters will occur. We also know that without getting too far into this, but of the 7 ashrams and the 7 soul types out there, there's one ashram that is not in incarnation at the moment. Interestingly, it's the 4th ray ashram. Now, that you might say, wait a minute, we just talked about the 4th ray. Yeah, I said that the whole of humanity as an entity is governed by the 4th ray. But individual souls could be any of the rays. In fact, many of you would have probably 2nd ray souls, I would imagine. But the actual causal bodies that are governed by the 4th ray, individual causal bodies, that's the 4th ray ashram. And that ashram isn't in manifestation at the moment. It has its shortest cycle. These ashrams manifest their disciples over vast cycles of time, but they have different lengths of time. So like the 2nd ray ashram, for centuries and centuries and centuries it's manifesting, whereas the 4th ray ashram has a shorter cycle. The last time it incarnated, it's what launched the Renaissance of Europe. So great disciples like Shakespeare, 4th ray, Da Vinci, 4th ray, Bach, Beethoven, 4th ray. That ashram has been out of incarnation, but it is said that it will begin the process of externalizing again, beginning around the year 2025. So we anticipate that by the middle of the century, the first wave of 4th ray souls will reach adulthood. In other words, another kind of human being is going to be back with us again. And that role, that purpose, speaking of purpose, that was asked earlier, their purpose will be to enliven the humanity's consciousness with a deeper understanding of the nature of art and beauty, and to recognize that beauty and art are synonymous terms. Beauty and truth are synonymous terms, and that we are given to understand that various forms of art will emerge, but the most important will be the so-called, the first, I should say, will be the art of language and the art of living. Boy, I'm on a tangent here. I better reel myself back. But that's what 2025 is also about. And it's the end of the era. So right now, what is the era of the Forerunners about that you and I are part of? It's because, by the way, if you're wondering who are these Forerunners, all I can say is, da-da, you are, we are. To the extent that your heart is ablaze with the sense of Christ-like love for the one humanity, to the extent that you're willing to transform yourself to be more effective in service to the greater whole, and that you want to commit yourself to service, You're part of that group. I'm calling them the forerunners. They're also called the new group of world servers. So maybe you've heard that term. And they're in their millions now, and they're in every category, every society. The members are found. It's an inner group, not an outer group. They're at all levels of evolution, from the probationary disciple all the way to a master. That's all part of this group. And they are found in all countries. They are associated with all political platforms, social platforms. Some are wealthy, some are poor, none of that matters. It's that they're placed precisely where they need to be placed in order to sound the note that they're destined to sound, as a function of preparing the way, because that's what this is about. The era of the forerunner is all about tilling the soil. And what is the soil? The soil is the soil of thought, the soil of ideations, because you see, humanity evolves through its relationship to ideations. You know, for instance, we evolve, we have good ideas. They come to us intuitively, become thought forms, and they enrich us. And then they run their course, and newer, more progressive ideas emerge. So all of humanity's evolution is really the ongoing unfolding of ideations over time. And if you're on the path, as I assume all of you would be, in a certain sense, in a kind of the most fundamental sense, service is about tilling the soil of ideations, promoting those pieces of wisdom that you readily recognize inside you, that you understand somehow, if they could be brought into the world, it would make a difference in a really good way and help create a more united humanity. So, okay, so that's what I mean by the conclave of 2025. There's more I could say about it, but you get a sense of it. And I would imagine that most of you would be part of that. Okay, by the way, another thing that's interesting, go ahead.
What's the name of the era after the era of the forerunner?
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know.
I thought the name might give us a clue what's coming there. Yeah.
Sorry, I don't have an answer to that one, and okay. It's never been asked. You know what? It's a good seed thought for meditation, Renee. Hint.
Thank you.
Yeah. Now, another really interesting thing that happens on the probationary path is, and actually early on in the awakening, is it is said that at the time of the awakening, you catch the master's eye. You catch the master's eye. Meaning, the master of the ashram that you're a part of, it's like it's hard to fathom how to put words into this, but that being is sort of looking at the entire ashram and sensing it toward the physical plane, and sees a new little spark of light flickering down there, and says to himself, a future initiate has just entered into the aura of the ashram. Take note, on with what I was doing. So there's a momentary recognition that the probationer, that a new candidate, for eventual initiation and eventual heightened responsibility to serve the ashram in the outer world, has entered into the broad aura of the ashram. So you catch the master's eye. Now, later on, as we get into the higher initiations, the attention of the master is far more persistent. But at this point, you catch the master's eye. So it's a really, really important thing. Okay. Now, with that in mind, I'd like to start our discussion about the first initiation. Okay, the first initiation. Now, the first initiation it's got a couple of names. The most common name for it, it's called the birth of the Christ within the heart. That's the most common name. And as I go through these initiations, you're going to see that the language associated with them have a kind of Christian feel to it. It's kind of a language that's been structured to help Western consciousness more relate to the story, but it isn't a Christian thing at all. It's applicable through all systems around the world. But you'll notice that. So here we have the birth of the Christ within the heart. But it has other names that are also kind of Christian. It's also been called in some of the literature, the birth of the new man. It's been called. It's also been called the initiation of Bethlehem. It's also been called the initiation of the bread. But the main title is the birth of the Christ within the heart. Now, in the most fundamental sense, this initiation is so pivotal, we are told, that it's as monumental in the long journey of the monad through, that it's equivalent to, by analogy, the magnitude of individualization that took place millions of years ago. Maybe I better explain that. So, we talk about reincarnation a lot. I've done seminars on reincarnation. And of course, needless to say, this philosophy fully agrees with the idea that the soul reincarnates as a function of perfecting itself. But a lot of times we don't realize that long before you ever were a human being, you as a monad spent millions of years before the human experience evolving through the animal kingdom. And before that, millions of years in the plant kingdom. And before that, millions of years in the mineral kingdom. Imagine that. At one time, we were all rolling stones. Mick Jagger would have been proud. And yet, there's I have a whole presentation called the monad sojourn. But when we get to the place where we finally enter into the human kingdom as monads, that's when you get an individualized causal body for the first time. And there's a whole mythology about how that happens. It's called the coming of the solar angels. So for the first time, the monad, your monad, for the first time, developed a sheath of intelligent substance of very high order with the assistance of a great deva, which is another word for angelic life. It's called the solar angel. And that is what we now call the causal body. And so consciousness individualizes for the first time at that time. What does that mean? Well, it means that for the first time you have the beginnings of the capacity to have individual consciousness and not merely instinctual animal consciousness. For the first time, the monad is now able to individualize its capacity to be aware. And that's what we call the period of individualization. It's literally the movement from the third kingdom of nature to the fourth, the animal domain to the human domain. And in the mythology of it, it's been associated, it's said that it happened individualization began in the middle of ancient Lemuria, 18 million years ago. And then it continued to about the middle of Atlantis, apparently. Now, that's not so important. Just understand that there is a phase in our evolution where we individualize for the first time. Now, back to the subject of the first initiation. I needed to lay that out for you. The first initiation is, by analogy, as important as the beginnings of the individualization process millions of years ago. Why? Because the first initiation is the beginning of the transition from the fourth kingdom, the human, to the fifth kingdom, the kingdom of the soul. You see, your soul is actually a member of another kingdom of nature. But it's probationary. It is a member, but it has to prove that it can manifest its love, its wisdom through the personality without distortion, without any baser vibrations, and become that perfected expression. And when that happens, you're fully in the fifth kingdom, and that's enlightenment. So in a certain sense, we could say that each of the initiations, particularly the first four, those are 4 steps that are transitional from one kingdom to the next, from the human to the fifth kingdom, which again is called the kingdom of the soul. And that's why we say that the first initiation is, by analogy, a bit like that thing that happened to us millions of years ago when we were rising out of beginning the transition out of the animal domain to a new kingdom of nature, the fourth kingdom, you see? So that's a way of looking at initiation. It's literally a kingdom transition, and it takes 4 full steps to complete it. We could look at it this way, and this is where when I'm with people live, I can do what I love to do, which is stand and walk and talk instead of a little camera here, because I have a little drama about this, but I'll just try to describe the drama to you. So it's as if the first initiation is you're putting the first foot into the next kingdom of nature. The second initiation is where you've got forward momentum. It's as if you've got stride going into the next kingdom. The third initiation is where the second foot goes into the next kingdom, but you're leaning against the door. And the fourth initiation, you're standing free from the door. And so that's a little metaphor, or a little way of trying to, I so wish I could dramatize it for you, but I can't. You get the idea, okay? Now, so this first initiation is really important. Now, the name is really important, the birth of the Christ within the heart. So right away, we see that it must have something to do with love. The birth of the Christ within the heart, naturally, it's going to be related to love. Because what happens here, there's 2 major things. This is the first thing, that the heart chakra comes alive in a broader way than it's ever been experienced before. The heart awakens to the Christ. Literally, the Christ energy is now much more fully expressive through your own chakra as a first degree initiate. And literally, the Christ now has another place to express through you. So it's a tremendous opening of the heart, but it's not just opening the heart, it's opening the heart, but with intelligence as well. It's not, a lot of people have a lot of heart, but haven't developed the mind. By the time you get to the first initiation, not only is the heart opening, but you've already realized that the mind is equally important and it's equally sacred. And so the development of your mind, particularly the higher mind, is as important as cultivating the heart. But here we're talking about, so it's not just an opening of love, it's about intelligent love, which is far superior than love on its own. Now, this opening of the heart in this way has an effect in the life. And one of the things it does is it helps us recognize in a more experiential way that truly we're all one. Because that, love is an interesting subject. I just did a webinar on it a couple of weeks ago, and it's hierarchical, and there's lower levels of love and higher levels, and this is higher because you're waking up to the love of the causal body. The causal body has another place to bring its energy through. And that love is more impersonal, but never forget that the highest forms of love are also the most impersonal. Well, the personality has sacred love too, so don't get me wrong, and that's sacred as well, but that's the kind of love that says, I love you, but not you. Where of course you don't verbalize it, but you get the idea. So but the love of the causal body that's now finding a gateway through the heart, that love is a broader love. It's not a selective love. It's the love of humanity. It's the love of the one, because it's an experience energetically, inwardly, of oneness. A capacity to see beyond the individual human differences, to feel that, there's something common here. There's something unitive here. There's some essence, because we are all one. Not just in kind, because we're all human, so we all have human experiences that are many similar, but we're one in essence. And that essence is the soul of humanity itself. So this recognition at the first initiation is important, because that quality of love then also causes the individual to feel an urge to serve, that there and a sense that there must be some purpose to my life. You know, it is said that a first-degree initiate, I'm going to use a quote here, assumes the burden of the future. Think about that for a minute. To assume the burden of the future, meaning to assume responsibility, to commit your life to the welfare of humanity somehow within the confines of your life circumstance, to support more and more oneness through that assumption of responsibility, and also to view it in a multi-generational fashion. In other words, it kind of reminds me of, some of the Native American tribes. They had this profound wisdom, where tribes never made big decisions for the tribe unless they considered 7 generations in the future. Imagine that. That's far from Western mind today. I mean, we're nothing like that, and yet, at a first-degree initiate begins to really sense that larger drama, that larger time frame, and recognizes that's the perception that's important as you commit yourself to serving humanity in the modesty of your own life circumstance. So to assume the burden of the future. You know, it's also, I mentioned that they start to really, first-degree initiate, as I would imagine many of you would be. I mean, most people that are clearly on the path are somewhere in that first degree, and many are trying to work toward the second. But it is said that, I'm going to give another quote. It's said that at the first initiation, the initiate experiences the first, quote, faint tremor of monadic destiny, unquote. The first tremor of monadic destiny is sensed. Now, you know what the monad is now. So, because the monad, beyond the soul, deeper than the soul, the monad is your true, ultimate, eternal self. It's just that it's so remote that we haven't re-identified with it yet. We have to earn our way to get there. But that monad is who we really are in the ultimate sense. And it's the place of unbelievable divine purpose. And at that first initiation, there's something, a faint tremor of it. Doesn't mean, oh, I now know my purpose. No, that's not the case. In fact, that doesn't happen for a couple more initiations in the clarity sense of it. But it does create a sense in the personality that I must have a purpose. I feel that I have a purpose. I don't know what it is, not sure what it is, but I must have a purpose. And I want to commit myself to navigating my life so that that purpose can somehow be more unfolded in my life. So then what happens is, you might ask back to what can we do about purpose at this phase? Well, there's 2 ways to think about it. One of them is I'm going to use a phrase from Master Morya. You know, Master Morya once was asked, and this is out of the Agni Yoga work of Helena Roerich, once was asked, and I paraphrase, something to the effect of, Master, how do you know what your soul's purpose is at any given time in your life? And his answer was pretty amazing. He said this, and again, I paraphrase, but in essence, he said this: if you want to know what your soul's purpose is at a time of your life, one of the clues is to look at the trend of your thinking. Now, you want to look at the trend of your thinking and your interests in the context of what impassions your thought life. I don't mean thinking about day-to-day stuff. I mean the thoughts you have that have to do with the way the world is, what division of interest is most interesting to you, what captures your thoughts, and what are the themes and the general subject matter that engages the mind over and over and over. Because in the middle of that trend of lofty thought is a golden thread. And that's it. That's really important. And that's a very much about, that's a speaking to a first degree initiate for sure. And, you know, whenever I think about that, I think of the work of Joseph Campbell. Do you remember who he was? Do you know who he is? The mythologist? Yes. Brilliant man. He's an American who was a professor, but he studied mythologies around the world. And he found that all mythologies, when you boil it down to essence, they're all saying the same thing. He wrote a book called The Hero's Journey. The Journey of a Thousand Faces, I think it's called. But it's really all about looking at all the mythologies around the world and realizing that they're metaphors of the journey of human evolution, and they're saying the same thing, really, in a certain way. And he was once asked, well, he made 3 words famous around the world when it comes to what your purpose is. You probably know it. The 3 words are, follow your bliss. Have you heard this? Follow your bliss. That's actually from Joseph Campbell. Now, as an esotericist, I would actually take that phrase and modify it a little bit. I would say it this way. Follow the trend of your thinking that gives rise to bliss. Follow the trend of your thinking that gives rise to bliss. So that's one of the ways that we really want to think about what our purpose is. It's sort of a clue. In addition to what I mentioned earlier when I said, learn about the rays and try to slowly work at understanding what is your soul ray. Look at that rising sign. That's important. Look at that North Node position. That's important. But this is another piece that's very important in terms of getting a handle on purpose. Another one that is very related to the phase of the first initiation period is, how to say this? It has to do with a recognition of your gifts. You know, the Tibetan says this about, he says, the inner gifts that a person has are actually from the causal body. Talent represents inherent ability within the personality, and skills are things that the personality develops while in incarnation. So gifts are from the causal body soul, talents are inherent abilities within the personality, and skills are things developed by the personality. But what are your gifts? Because your gifts are from the soul. And you can bet for sure that your purpose is going to include your gifts. So know those gifts. And what I found with people, and I'm speaking of myself as well here, but a lot of times people, they take their own gifts for granted. It's like it doesn't even feel like a gift. People say to you, oh, you're really good at that. And for you, you might say to yourself, it's just how I am. It's not anything special. But in fact, it is special and it's important. So know your gifts. And if you follow your gifts, follow the trend of your thinking, you will slowly navigate yourself exactly in the way that the ashram is hoping you will, and you'll get closer and closer to what it is that is the full responsibility that you have as defined by the ashram that you're from. I hope that's all making sense to you. Yeah. Okay. Now, more to say about the first initiation. It's so rich. There's some big things happening in the chakra system with the first initiation. Now, the chakras are interesting because they're transferences. Chakras are energies that transfer. just occurred to me, I might have a good visual on this that I didn't. Let me just, if you bear with me just a minute, I'm going to get another PowerPoint up that might help us with this. Yeah, okay. All right, so in just to simply, let me show you this image and talk about it. Because in many ways, the whole path has a lot to do with the transmutation of the chakra system. Okay, so let's take first a look at this. So I've got, I don't know if, I hope you can see that okay. So I'm listing, there should be there, it's missing a chakra here, but anyway, there's one other chakra here it's not being shown, it's the base. And that's unfortunate. What happens is the lower chakras are the chakras that dominate in the first part of the life, and the higher chakras dominate as you're on the path or are trying to become dominant. So they transfer. So let me show you this. Here we have 6 of them now. The lower chakras, they're prior to being on the path, the lower chakras dominate because those are the chakras primarily used by the integrated personality. And the upper chakras are more passive, they're negative and undeveloped. Negative doesn't mean bad. Negative just means they're not as fully developed in this context. But there are chakra transfers that occur. And when you're on the path, that's the story. They're transmuted. Lower chakras must be transmuted to higher chakras. So in the end, when we're fully enlightened, all of the upper chakras become dominant, positive, and well-developed, whereas the lower become passive, negative, and developed, but quiescent. And there's 2 transfers that are important, particularly at the first initiation. This one is the first one. The energy of the solar plexus has to be lifted to the heart, transmuted into the heart. It's not like you have to try to do this. It's one of those things where slowly, as you evolve your consciousness on the probationary path and purify yourself, there's a transmutation process occurring. And the reason why those 2 are so close together in this is because they both are related to the law of attraction. The solar plexus is the place of desire, which is a manifestation of the law of attraction on a personality level. It's form's attraction to form, whereas the higher is the quality of Christ-like love. It's love as attraction to the one. So when we talk about the journey to enlightenment, this is just a way of understanding that journey as it pertains to chakra transitions and chakra development. Now, when this is occurring, simultaneously, there's an interactive dynamic that begins to occur between the ajna and the crown. Those 2 come on rapport, and that is the first beginnings of what will become the third eye in those 2 coming onto rapport. So a lot of this transfer, not all of it, it's not completed at the first initiation, but a good percentage of it is. The other that transfers is here. The sacral center is transmuted its energy into the throat. That's its higher octave, you might say. You might say, well, why? Why would those 2 be related? Because for the same reason, they too are connected to an underlying commonality of principle, and it's this, the creative principle. Both the sacral center and the throat center are agencies of creativeness. In the lower, it's creativity, that perpetuation of the species, the procreative urge. Whereas the upper, the throat chakra, this is the great chakra of divine ideations. It's through your throat that the soul shapes new and progressive ideas for expression as a function of service to the outer world. So there's a lot of transmutation going on here as well. It's not complete at the first by any means, but a good deal of that transmutation has occurred. And a further binding is occurring between the crown and the ajna. A further unitive, energetic rapport between those two is occurring. So both of those are very related to the first initiation and a bit of the second initiation. I'll show you the last slide here, which is about the last phase, and that's the base to the crown. Now that is a story, a different story. That's about how to put this. That's about the lifting of the Kundalini, really, the lifting of the Kundalini. And they're both based upon the same principle again, and that's the principle of will. The lower base chakra, it's the will of form. It generates the survival instinct. But the higher, the crown, that's the expression of the soul's purpose. This starts to really become operative at the third initiation and has its full consummation at the fifth initiation. And again, we have a huge dynamics going on here as well. So again, this is a bit of a tangent, but I wanted you to see when I say to you that the initiations have a relationship to chakra transmutation. Hopefully this model will at least give you a feel for what I'm referring to there. Okay. Okay, now, I should mention also that these initiations, I said, are ruled by rays. The first initiation, the ray of the 7 rays, the ray that is most associated with it is the 7th ray. Not surprising, therefore, that we are going into a 7th ray age. You know, it's so interesting. We often talk about the transition between the Piscean age and the Aquarian age, but in the mainstream particularly, or the spiritual community, there's not as much understanding that there's another transfer going on between the 6th ray age and the 7th ray age, and an overlap as well. But it makes sense that the 7th ray would be very much related to this, because so much of the first initiation has to do with the soul taking mastery over the physical instrument. And that's the physical instrument is related to the physical plane. Remember the planes of consciousness, the bottom plane, that's the 7th plane, the physical plane, and it's governed by the 7th ray. And so it's not surprising that humanity is approaching the first initiation and that it's also at the same time entering into a 7th ray age. It all fits. It all fits. So that gets me into point 2. So up to this point, I've been sharing with you the love nature, the service nature that arises from the first initiation, and something having to do with the chakras as in the process. Now, let's talk about the second element to this. And that's what I just mentioned, that the soul takes dominion over what is sometimes called the physical elemental, which just means it takes dominion over the appetites of the physical body. In other words, now your higher self has much more dominion over the physical appetites. So that doesn't mean that, oh no, you can't ever eat anymore. It doesn't mean that you no longer have a sexual life. It doesn't mean anything like that. It means two things. Number one, it means that when it comes to those physical appetites, there's a part of you that can remain the observer and have regulatory oversight over those physical appetites. And rather than the appetite itself being the dominating, guiding force of the personality's behavior, it means now there's a higher part of you that has this sort of overview of discipline, transformation, and wise utilization of those appetites, as opposed to having somewhat unbridledness to it. So that's part of what I'm talking about when I say that the first initiation has a lot to do with mastery over the physical. But it's also the physical out here in the world. It's in the physical nature of life. It's in how we interface with other people. How do we coordinate our lives? How well do we interface with the physical dimension of life? And so, for instance, there's a lot of emphasis on developing more skill and importance to a coordinated physical life pattern, to develop patterns of life that make you more efficient as a disciple in service to the outer world. Not surprising, that's going to connect to the seventh ray as well, because the seventh ray is the ray of efficient action. So it all ties together. So what I'm really saying to you is that this initiation has two major aspects to it. The first is the opening of the heart, the sense of service, the recognition that you sense the humanity is one, and a growing commitment to say, I may not know exactly what my purpose is, but I feel I can do something to make a difference out in the world, and I'm going to do it. So those are the two big streams. Now, if I take this whole thing and talk about it from a humanity perspective, well, let's talk about that for a minute, because you may recall earlier I said that humanity is approaching the first initiation as well, collectively. And we think that once we get through the burning ground phase, it's right in front of us then. But in a way, that's what this is about, because what really is trying to happen in this world of craziness these days is that humanity is struggling to try to figure out how to be one. How to be one. And if we don't figure that out pretty soon, we're all in big trouble. And so that sense of oneness is the underlying goal. Now, one of the greatest obstacles to humanity and its ability to sense oneness is what is called the heresy of separateness. The heresy of separateness. And so that's the underlying belief that somehow we're separate from one another. But also, the problem of appetite in humanity's world. Humanity has lost control of its own appetite. And it has lost its understanding of right relationship, to be honest with you. Right relationship is a very central theme to be cultivated, understood, and lived by as a first degree initiate. Right relationship, for instance, what is the right relationship between men and women? What's the right relationship between religion and religion? What's the right relationship between mind and heart? What's the right relationship between nation and nation? What's the right relationship between a government and those it governs? What's the right relationship between humanity and Mother Nature? What's the right relationship between humanity and resources? All of these are incredibly important questions that are very, very central to having to the theme of the first initiation, whether individually considered in terms of an individual that's approaching or has taken the first initiation, or humanity as a whole. Right relationship. And what is the burning ground that we see in the world today? It's a growing recognition of wrong relationship. And, a good example would be the climate issue. 50 years ago, no one was talking, or very few people were talking about the climate crisis. You didn't hear those terms. But now, more and more disciples are coming into the world. More and more disciples have a deeper awakening to the nature of what is right relationship. And so they become more and more awakened to the idea that when it comes to humanity's relationship with Mother Nature, it's really very wrong relationship. Mm-hmm. So the burning ground is nothing more than the result of a growing recognition of wrong relationship and a growing urge to find right relationship. And all of that is connected to the first initiation, friends, all of that. And right relationship has to do with other things as well. What is the right, we've got tremendous recognitions of wrong relationship in the world. Look at, a few years ago, I remember reading that, what was it? I think at the time, this is probably 10 years ago, so it's probably much worse now, but it was said that approximately 30,000 people die per day of either starvation or disease caused by malnutrition. 30,000 people a day. Now imagine what that would be like if 30,000 people in New Zealand, I'm going to make this up, I don't know, but let's say that that's the population of Nelson, or the population of, a 30,000 population. That's like that town gone in a single day. And yet there's a surplus of something like 4% food in the world today. That's a good example of wrong relationship. Wrong relationship is also in wrong distribution of resources. Why is it that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer? That's wrong relationship. That's an inability to recognize fundamentally that we're all one. So you can see what's going on in the world today. It's so related to this struggle to awaken to wrong relationship and do something about it to create right relationship. All of that's first initiation stuff. That's for sure, first initiation stuff. So, and appetite as well. I mean, just generally the appetite. Unbridled consumption is a great problem in the human condition right now, and what we call consumerism, because it's promoting consumption well beyond what is needed. And it's based upon an inability to correctly recognize the difference between want and need. So all of this is tied into a discussion of, I just am trying to frame it for you in terms of understanding humanity as it approaches this first initiation. But now I'm trying to show you that it also applies to the individual. So your appetites are at the first initiation, and as a first degree initiation, are better regulated. You do have a greater sense of what is need versus want, that sort of thing. So it's a huge, huge thing. Now, I realize that we're running out of, our session is ending pretty soon here. This would be a good time to open it up for questions.
My question was about the awakening and that sort of mystical sensation that then occurs, the sense of the soul that's perceived at that time. And I just wondered how that fits in with other mystical experiences such as near-death experiences, but also the mystical experiences that people get during taking off substances like recreational drugs, how that would fit in with that initiatory journey, whether there's any relationship between the two.
Well, there's some correlation. It's not one of those things where to take initiation, you have to be smoking a lot of weed. It's nothing like that. But it's much more about, in a way, it's all about a changing of consciousness. And so some people want to explore it by, changing the chemistry of their brain a little bit through drugs to create a mystical experience. But in the deeper sense, that's not what's necessary. What's necessary is that actually more and more your day-to-day life becomes kind of a mystical realization. And those mystical experiences that people have unrelated to drugs, those are really wonderful because in a certain sense, they represent peak experiences or sometimes they're called epiphany experiences. And those experiences are really important because even though they're short-lived, they do help you to recognize what's coming. In other words, those mystical experiences could be viewed as the promise of the future, and they kind of seed your consciousness with a recognition of what's trying to unfold in terms of the expansion of consciousness. So fundamentally, I think all of those are very important. And the further you are on the path, the more your mind is developed. And the more your mind is developed, the more you have an instrument that can correctly interpret that mystical experience. So yeah, they do tie together.
Okay.
I guess what I was pondering was with the near-death experiences, not everyone that whose heart stops has a near-death experience. And I wondered, are the people that have a near-death experience people who have already awakened? If you hadn't awakened yet, would a near-death, would death or apparent death actually, would you actually have that experience, or would you be one of those people that came back and experienced nothing at all?
It does. I have never heard that notion before. This is new to me. I've never heard the notion that somebody, let's put this another way. I have no reason to believe that a person that doesn't experience a near-death have a near-death experience, that they're not on the path, and that a person that does have that is on the path. I have no reason to believe that that's an accurate thing to say. If a person has their heart stops and they have no memory of anything, that I don't necessarily think that means that they're not on the path yet. They could be. It could be true, but may not be true, because another variable that might be part of that is a karmic variable. It could be, for instance, that from a karmic perspective, that in a person went through a near-death experience but has no memory of anything happening because there was some sort of karmic necessity for there to be no memory of it.
Yeah.
While a person that you could have a person that's not on the path that does have a near experience, and that also could be karmically based as well. So I guess that what I'm saying is there's probably more variables in it than we typically think. And I'm not saying that out of having studied the esoteric philosophy, because I've never read that before, I've never studied that. But I'm kind of using my own intuition on this to say to you that I wouldn't necessarily make that assumption.
Mm. I guess I wondered the same with drugs, in terms of, because in theosophy, drug use is most definitely discouraged. Yeah. And I wondered whether there was a disadvantage in having a drug-induced mystical experience. Yeah.
I'm not so sure I would be as stark about that as perhaps theosophy is. I personally know some people, many people that I know, a few anyway, who in the 60s, they were big drug takers, and it really opened them up. And they will even tell you today, even though they don't do any of that anymore, they would tell you today that those experiences actually is what transformed them into the kind of the path that they're on now, even though it's completely free of drugs today. So I'm not so sure that I would wholeheartely make the statement that maybe theosophy is making. But in general, I think that's true. In general, I think that the use of drugs to create those effects is counterproductive in general, but not in specifics. There's plenty of examples of people that have become more enlivened in their spiritual life because of those early experiences with drugs.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Wendy. And we've just got Luz. Oh, it's Murray first. No, Luz. I'll do Luz and then Murray. Okay.
I just wonder about the statistics in medical conditions, because you're talking about we're moving to a next rate, the 7 ray, and also developing or connecting the mind with the heart. I just wonder about these statistics of populations coming into dementia, Alzheimer, and
I'm sorry, I couldn't say that again. The last sentence, I didn't quite hear that. Say that again.
Yeah, if populations are coming into dementia and Alzheimer's.
And I wonder if you're talking about that humanity is moving into an increase in 2025. What are the reasons for that? Is karmatic, or these are populations that are on a level of evolution that is positive or negative?
Here's what I think you asked. You're talking about dementia and autism and that sort of thing, and the rise of that. And is there a connection between where humanity is and that? Is that about what you're saying?
Correct.
Okay, great. I think the answer is absolutely yes, because what's happening is that, as I said, we're in two major transitions at the same time. Pisces to Aquarius, 6th ray age to 7th ray age, and an enormous overlap between the two. People have different views in terms of how big that overlap is, but a lot of the people that I kind of connect with, we often estimate it at about a 200-year period, and we're in the middle of it, right about at the middle. And at the middle is where we're going to have the greatest polarities, but it does mean that the collective consciousness of humanity is going to be very polarizing, because there's these mix of energies, rather than when we're more in the middle of an age, it stabilizes because it's more of a singular energy. So with that mix of energies that are playing out strongly in the collective consciousness of humanity, you're going to have a lot of anomalies that arise psychologically in the human kingdom. And you're going to have a lot of tension and a lot of negative things and conflict and so forth. But you will have, it makes sense to me that you would have a rise in dementia and autism and that sort of thing, because the conditions for incarnating can create new challenges. Now, autism is, there's a lot of reasons for autism, I think, and it really has never been fully discussed in esoteric literature that I have found anyway. But my view is that autism is a manifestation that when the soul is incarnating, as it's trying to build its mental sheath, and there's a whole process of how the soul begins to attract substance to become the mental body, substance to become the emotional body, and ultimately the physical, that because of the mental plane has so much polarity and confusion in it because of these transitions, there are mishaps that can happen in the construction of the mental body. And that mishap can manifest itself as autism. I hope that makes sense to you.
Yeah, so that's one condition on Alzheimer, Parkinson, and dementia are within another level.
Let me try to answer it, because I think I know what you're getting at, and I can't direct to that particular doctor or anything like that. But I can make a comment about dementia and Alzheimer's and that sort of thing. And I'm generalizing because I think there is probably more than one explanation for these things. And medicine is certainly working hard to find what are the chemical components that lead to Alzheimer's, et cetera. But there's another principle involved here too, from a more esoteric perspective, that needs to be included in the equation of thought around this. And that is that toward the latter part of the life, which is where you mostly find dementia, that when the soul is going to, there's a time when the soul begins to, what is said, turn its face from its reflection. It's an interesting way of saying it, but there's a time when the soul is beginning its process of death, actually, but it's a slow process. And as it starts to turn its face, which is just a metaphor saying it's turning its attention more and more away from the physical manifestation, that can create over time in the brain a kind of atrophy that creates the neurological anomalies that science is saying is very much connected to these sorts of disorders. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that, and this is not my area of expertise at all, but I'm trying to say that sometimes Alzheimer's can represent a very slow withdrawal of the soul and the consciousness thread. Now, when you incarnate, there are three, but two main threads, they're called. One is the consciousness thread, which has a relationship to the Antakarana on a higher level, and another is called the life thread. Now, the consciousness thread descends from the causal body and all the way down to the physical and anchors itself in the etheric area of the center of the head near the pineal gland. While the life thread is what it descends actually from the monad all the way through the causal body and anchors itself in the heart chakra. And these two threads are just speaking of streams of soul influence. So the life thread, the one that's entering through the heart, that is what is maintaining the physical instrument. And it's not surprising that it would be associated with the heart, because there's a long association with blood as being the substance of life and distribution. Whereas the consciousness thread anchors itself in the center of the brain cavity in the region of the pineal gland and the ventricles. Now, when you fall asleep, there's a whole process by which the consciousness thread dislodges itself from the brain cavity and withdraws itself and slowly makes its way back to the causal body. And there's a whole fascinating study of how that defines the nature of dream life as it's returning back. That's another workshop. But the life thread stays. Now, and then when you wake up, your consciousness thread is back anchored in the brain cavity again. For people that have Alzheimer's, the life thread is beginning to abstract as well. And the whole attention of the soul is beginning to move away from the outer garment, but slowly. And yet the life thread remains. And that's another possible dynamic that's going on that might give explanation to some aspects of those types of problems.
I remember it's coma. When somebody's coma and coma stage, that's another wondering if esoterically they're going into maybe that place too. And when they wake up, and then the other is the actor was I think it's Dr. Oliver's create that book about that condition of coma. And there's a movie, and Robert De Niro was the patient. So somebody knows the name.
All right. Thank you, Liz.
Okay, thank you. Yep.
Also,
Any more? You want to wait till after lunch, or do you want to more questions? Or
we might as well finish this and one last question. So I'll just finish this.
Okay.
A note was just put forward from Kirsty. She said, clinically, dementia and Parkinson's have reduced the lifespan physically. She just wanted to put that comment in. And I had a comment to do with this as well, with Alzheimer's itself. It can actually be a great gift to the family. It moves them in their patterns, in their mind and things. So in a way, it's a flowering prior to the death of that particular personality for the beings around it. That's been my experience there. So
that can be very true too. That can be there's a karmic element there. That's a karmic. In other words, there's a karmic intention to facilitate an opportunity for compassionate response from family members and so forth too. That's all possible. Now, isn't this a great example though of how we're doing a presentation on initiation and yet now we're talking about Alzheimer's? That's the great challenge of this philosophy, is that we want to see connections in a whole bunch of ways, and I love to do that, but it is easy to get off course too. So nonetheless, So-
Okay, this is our last question before we go to lunch. Murray?
Sure.
I have been watching a lot of the near-death experiences online recently, and a reasonably high proportion of them are of transcendent experiences which transform the person. And especially when they've had the experience of being in an ocean of love, and they nearly all describe that region as being home. And I think I have really wanted to bring this out because it's a positive outcome. And I actually think that this is a new spiritual education project on the planet. I wonder what your comments on that would be.
And I fully agree with that. That in a way, when you die, you're on your way home.
Yes.
And there's two homes. There's two homes. There's the first home, which is the causal body itself, and that's home because that's where you're trying to. That's where the fullness of your capacity to understand yourself. But on a higher level, there's another home, and that's the ashram itself. In fact, that's what the word ashram means. It means your spiritual home. So whether it's near death, whether it's coma, whether it's being free from karma and therefore no longer having to incarnate, all of that is about going home. Absolutely.
Thank you. That's it.
Okay, thanks, William. We'll bring this second session to a close.
I'll see you then. Okay.